At the heart of this part of lecture lies the simple fact that sometimes things go wrong while the program is running. So maybe you're reading files from disk and it turns out one of them is 380 terabytes or something, and you can't actually load that all into memory. You don't have that much. Maybe you try to create an object and then cast it as something that it is not. That is, the dynamic types don't line up, and so you get a class cast exception. Maybe we get a -1 array index out of bounds error like we had before. And so the Java approach to those situations is to throw an exception. So what does that mean? Well, the program stops what it's doing and it does something else. And so far, that something else has been crashing and printing out a message that is hopefully useful to the user or programmer of that class. So as we saw in our example before, those exceptions can occur either implicitly. Like, for example, I create an object that's a string, and it's dynamic type of string. And then I try to cast it as a planet, and that doesn't work, and we get a class cast exception. We also saw we can have explicit exceptions. And so I'll give another example here. Maybe we print out a message, and then we throw a runtime exception for no reason at all. And so if we actually run this program, we'll get the printed message, and then the exception happens for no reason. So I'll note here that this is not entirely new. The word throw is new. We didn't have that keyword. But new runtime exception, that's actually just like any other object instantiation we did in the past. It creates a new object of type runtime exception, and it is thrown. So what's a runtime exception exactly? Well, runtime exceptions are part of the Java Lang package, and each Java Lang runtime exception, it is a Java Lang exception. In other words, this is a subclass of the exception class, and that in turn is a subclass of throwable, and throwable is in turn a subclass of object. And so what Java does is any throwable that you may conceive, an exception or otherwise, can be thrown with the throw keyword. And as a result, what Java will do when it sees that, the way the interpreter works is it says, okay, stop what you're doing. You've been given an exception and you break the usual flow of control. And we'll talk about what happens from there in a moment. So exceptions, though, I just want to mention that they're instances of classes, just like pretty much everything else in Java, and has a couple different constructors. And once it's thrown, then something interesting happens. So what we've seen, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that usually a program just crashes, but you can actually also catch an exception. And this is a concept you may have seen in another language, or maybe not. So basically what catching does is it prevents the program from crashing when it's running. So suppose I create a new dog named Lucy, who's a retriever weighing 80 pounds. So maybe Lucy becomes angry, and then if we try to pet the dog, that is, Lucy receives a pat, if she's upset, she'll throw an exception and say, I don't want to get touched. But rather than letting the program crash, we'll actually catch that exception and print it out and let the code keep running. So in this case, when we run this program, it says, tried to pat. However, we got a runtime exception, grr, snarl, snarl. That's the exception here. That's apparently the message thrown by Lucy. But after catching that exception, the program keeps running. So rather than crashing at this point and never printing, we actually get down here to this final print line and we get Lucy is a displeased retriever weighing 80 pounds. So in this case, the code didn't crash because we caught the exception. Now, why would you ever do that? Well, one reason is you can actually maybe take corrective action inside of a catch block. So suppose I create a new dog, Lucy, who's a retriever and weighs 80 pounds. Maybe Lucy becomes angry. And then when the code runs, whenever the dog tries to get patted, then we will print out the exception and then feed the dog a banana, hopefully to appease it. The dog will then receive a pat again, and then we'll print, and let's see what happens. So in this case, we say Java exception demo, Lucy becomes upset. We try to pat Lucy, and we get Java Lang runtime exception, snarl, snarl. However, we then feed the dog a banana, and apparently this eat treat method prints out Lucy munches the banana. We then try to pet Lucy, and in this case, Lucy enjoys the pat. She did not throw an exception this time, which is great. And then finally, we can print out Lucy, and this time she's a happy retriever weighing 80 pounds. So good job, we have caught something. Now this kind of catching, right, this is kind of a silly example, but in the real world, maybe the exception you get is that like an antenna is not extended on a robot. So if you catch that exception, you can then extend the antenna and proceed as you want it. Sometimes it's not actually a corrective action, and we just want to write out a log file or turn on a blinking light or whatever it may be. There are reasons for particular exceptions. We might have different things happen.